Welcome, everyone, to this exclusive Nobody Studios Culture live stream show. I'm your host, Sejal Thacker, and I am delighted to have my good friend Scott Mason joining us for today's conversation. Welcome, Scott.
I am utterly delighted to be here, Sejal. Thank you for having me.
Oh my God. So for those of you that don't know Scott Mason, you need to connect with him on LinkedIn. I've known Scott for several years, and I'm a huge fan of his work. And as you'll see throughout this conversation, Scott and I have a lot in common, right? So for one, we're both recovering lawyers. I have to start with that. And now Scott helps people, attorneys specifically, to level up on their leadership skills. So he's a coach, a transformational coach. He has a mastermind program where he helps people achieve professional freedom. So you'll hear a little bit more about how he helps people take their careers to the next level. And his moniker is the Myth Slayer. And this really captures the essence of what I think it means to challenge status quo. So Scott, tell us a little bit more about your personal journey and how did it lead you to becoming a myth slayer?
You know, when I was in law school, I never would have imagined that one day I would be on a live stream with you, Sejal, for Nobody Studios, where I have a job hosting a podcast on psychedelics. And then I also am a myth slayer talking about how Greek myths can help change lawyers' lives. But that's where it all ended up. And the big lesson before I even get started in answering your question is to let life take you where it will. Don't control it. Just go with the flow and joy, and everything that you wanted in life can and will happen. I practiced law for nearly 25 years. Actually, nearly 20 years working in various positions with the city of New York, starting out as a litigator, doing everything from social service, institutional reforms, to building safety regulation, to being able to being the second in command of New York City's entire administrative tribunal system. I went from there into being chief legal officer for the country's largest domestic violence shelter service provider. It also ran homeless shelters. But I felt my calling ultimately wasn't working for others. It wasn't necessarily being there cleaning up other people's problems or providing advice as to how their visions could come into place. My true calling was enacting my own vision. I stepped into entrepreneurship as the co-owner of a manufacturing company, but ultimately felt the draw to coaching, to speaking, and to going down the particular path that led me to be sitting right here by you today. And I'm trying to point in the right direction on this live stream.
Well, you've got fans already, Scott. We've got Dave Schultz joining us. And he says, get into the flow that floats your boat. That's right, Dave. Thank you so much for joining us. And Scott, I love your work. You know, I know about what you do and how you do it. And the role of debunking myths, right, is more important now, more now than ever. And I love like how you and I both are passionate about, and we work towards helping to dispel these myths by, you know, really empowering people. And I think both of us do the same thing, right? We want to provide accurate information. We want to get people to start using their own critical thinking. And again, especially now that information is there at our fingertips, we need to dispel myths more than ever, right? And so let's jump into the exciting stuff that you're doing at the studio, right? So one of the reasons I love doing this show is I get to ask people what attracted them to the Nobody Studios journey. And so tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to join the journey. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the projects that you're involved with.
Thank you. So initially what attracted me to being involved with Nobody Studios was the underlying mission as expressed through Nobody Studios branding and name. One of the most destructive things that I have seen in leadership and in people's personal lives is the dominance of ego as a driving force in their behavior and in their professional affiliation. Nobody Studios, almost by virtue of its name, sets that aside for something larger. So any studio that would call itself Nobody's Studio, I'm going to be interested in for that reason and no other reason alone. But also think about what makes great leadership, what makes someone or something part of a movement or part of a social change that's truly disruptive and transformational. It is the desire to attract people who are innovative, who are creative, and to nurture those talents, to say, you are someone awesome. This is where you can fit within our organization, assuming such a fit exists. And then how can you be part of leveraging all of that to bring that disruption about? And at the end of the day, the messaging that I received from you, from Mark McNally, Tiffany Hansen, Kiara, other people that were my initial contacts with the Nobody Studios sent that message loud and clear. The other thing that I have to say that I really believe in and that has attracted me to Nobody Studios from day one is the audacity of its ambition. I think if you're going to be on this planet, you might as well try and live like an Olympian god. And the goals of creating as many companies with as much disruptive force as Nobody Studios has a vision for, to me, that's setting everyone involved to live up like that Olympian god.
You're so awesome, Scott. Seriously, I can feel your energy from across the screen. How do you always do that every single time we talk?
It's your fault. You bring it out.
I've been with the studio for almost like over 3 years now, right? And I'll have to agree with you. We definitely attract people who are eager to create a huge, massive impact, and they're not afraid to venture into the unknown, right? And usually it's people. You have two sides, right? Whenever I tell people that we want to build 100 companies in 5 years, either they're going to come and be like, sign me up, I want to learn more, or they're going to say, you're nuts, and they want to go the other direction, right? And so I'm so grateful that you're on this journey with me and the rest of the Nobodies. You've spoken to our leadership team already. We brought you on, and people are still talking about the presentation. You really provided some practical tips to people to help them be resilient leaders and really kind of think more creatively. So before we jump into some of your tips, I want you to talk to the leadership team. Tell us a little bit about some of the projects you're working on in the studio, because you're doing some pretty cool stuff. And I want to make sure if people are joining us for the first time, that they learn about some of the other stuff that you're working on. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, we have all of our prior live streams on our YouTube channel. So make sure that you check those out. But Scott, tell us a little bit about what you're working on at the studio.
So the big project that I'm working on, and have been working on since 2022, is as the podcast host for the one and only Webdelics, which is building itself into the number one psychedelic platform on the planet. It has been a truly transformative, life-changing journey for me, not just in terms of the subject matter that I became familiar with as someone who was not in the psychedelic space when I signed on to be the host, but in terms of my own personal life. And when I think about how exposure to and involvement in this world has changed me so fundamentally, I can't help but be deeply proud to be the messenger for a podcast that is able to provide credible, curated, vetted, scientifically accurate information, not just mindless rah-rah cheerleading, but the truth, as well as deep, transformational human stories about the true power of these medicines to help folks who are struggling. And as you of all people know, Sejal, due to the work that you do, we are in a mental health crisis in the Western world. These tools can turn things around at a level and at a scale beyond what's imaginable. It's truly something that has come to speak to my heart, and that I will always be proud to have as part of my legacy.
Yeah, thank you. And for those of you, Webdelics is one of our new co's. So it's a platform that is dedicated to, as Scott said, educating people about psychedelics. And really the goal of the platform is to provide people with unbiased information and trustworthy resources, right? And it's really about what Scott does, as a coach, is to reframe this narrative, around this topic of potentially life-changing medicines. And Scott, I have to tell you, you've done such a great job as the host of Webdelics because you've created a space. No, I mean, I'm a couple episodes behind now, but you really have created a space where we could destigmatize plant medicine and have these open conversations and stories, like you said, from people who have lived through some unforeseen challenges, things that have happened in their lives, and they've had to pivot as leaders and founders. That's one of the topics I wanted to talk to you about. It's a great way to pivot into that conversation because we have to also deal with unforeseen challenges and things happen and we need to know. So speak to the founders at the studio or that are listening, speak to the leaders at Nobody Studios and anybody else that watches this episode. Maybe you could share a story where you had to deal with something in your leadership or entrepreneur journey where you had to pivot because of something that was unexpected or unforeseen. And what were some of the lessons that you learned in that situation?
There are so many pivots I've had to make that it is.
I've seen some of those.
Yeah, right. You know them all. That some of them have been next to. It's almost impossible to pick which one to discuss. But I will share with you one that goes as to what makes someone a great, resilient, creative, and connected leader. My first entrepreneurial journey was, as I think I mentioned earlier, as a co-owner of a manufacturing company. And this manufacturing company originally started with me and a business partner in a little factory in Brooklyn. It was us two owners and then an intern from the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce. And we very rapidly grew and scaled. We opened up another factory in a second location, or we started moving into having clients of a global stature. But scaling is one thing to think about, imagine, dream about, and even plan for. It's another thing to live out. It takes a lot out of you. And my business partner and I ultimately had different visions as to what scaling should be for this company and how that would play out. So we had a business divorce. Sometimes when I think about it, it's hard not to get emotional because it was a lot like losing a child. I put my heart and my soul into this, and suddenly it was gone. And I was ashamed too, because I thought that people would view me as a failure. I didn't know what to do next. We agreed that my business partner should maintain the business and that I should exit. But what that would mean in the world, I had no idea. And I'll never forget, I was depressed. I was scared. I live near Central Park here in New York City. And one night I went for a bike ride to a special event in Harlem. And in order to get to that special event, I had to literally ride my bicycle through the park. It was raining. It was dark. At the time, I was wearing some glasses, and those glasses got misted up in the rain. And so I was riding in the rain in the park at night with misty glasses. And I was thinking about what was to come next and my future or lack thereof. I was overwhelmed. Suddenly, I realized that every single step I had taken in my career, albeit ostensibly successful, had not been driven by who and what I was as a leader inside. What was my purpose? What were my values? And what were the larger purposes that those could connect to in order to fully and truly express myself as a leader? I started to cry as I was riding in the bike in the rain at night with misty glasses. Now, fortunately, I didn't crash and die, but I learned something then, which is that who and what you are as a leader needs to be defined internally outside of your company's mission, outside of what you're assigned and has to do within your organization, even outside of the organization itself or social expectations about what leaders are, but fundamentally connected to your unique purpose, tied to your values, bringing in everything that you have brought from your past, and then ultimately connected through the heart and unique to you. Why are you and only you a leader? What does leadership stand for for you. Once you understand that, the oracle inside of you has spoken, and you'll have that resilience, creativity, and you'll be able to inspire your team to be the same.
Yeah, no. And for a second there, when you were talking about your bike ride, I thought you were talking about the one that you took me on for 15 miles when we were in New York. It was raining. We were riding a bike. I had glasses on. I was like, wait, I still am traumatized from that bike ride, Scott Mason. I'm never going to let you forget about that.
You know, if it's giving you PTSD, maybe you should go to www.webdelics.com.
And speaking of Webdelics, we have Kyle Kane joining us. Thank you, Kyle. And he's put the Webdelics website up. So I put it up on the screen here for anyone that wants to look at it, right? And learn a little bit more about the community there and all the resources that are available. But so thank you for setting up the stage about, I really do agree with you. It starts internally, you know, and I had a similar moment in my journey too. I was working for this company and it wasn't bringing me any sort of satisfaction or fulfillment. And I wasn't connecting with my inner leader, like you put inside. And since then, you know, after going on my own and starting my own business, you know, there's been many times where I've had to really question, are these really my non-negotiable values, or are these the values that I want to live today? And sometimes we have to be adaptable. And especially during the tough times, you have to build some strategies to help you be resilient, right? And so what are some strategies? Give us some practical strategies for people on how they can, when they're going through tough times, what can they do to build resilience and get through those tough times? I've seen you, I'll just say this for everybody, I've seen Scott Mason go through some intense situations, and you are really, when I see how you've come out from the other side and how you've overcome those tough times, you're speaking from experience. And that's why I love this practical advice that he's going to share with us, because he's lived it and now he's speaking from his experience and he's helping people so that it's easier for them when they go through these tough times, right?
Yeah. And maybe I'll use that as a sort of entryway into some of the things that I'm going to share with you. Now, I, of course, have a transformational process that helps people become connected to these things and then express themselves as leaders. But I'm actually going to answer this in a way that's more personal. What you're talking about with regard to these tough times, Sejal, let's just throw it out here. You and I both know that last year I suddenly came down with a very dramatic, awful, life-threatening illness. And again, as I speak about this, it's going to be very difficult not to get emotional, but I feel like those emotions need to be out there because people need to understand. To frame this for folks, I literally woke up one day feeling like an ice pick was stabbing me in the neck. And of course, no ice pick was. And symptoms piled upon symptoms, upon symptoms, upon symptoms. And before long, I'd lost 20 pounds, like in a matter of days. I wasn't eating. I was sleeping like 20 hours a night. And I was suddenly unable to walk or even stand. I was rushed to the hospital. While I was there, if I turned my head at all, my entire nerves and my back and my thighs and my hips all would go on fire, and I'd start involuntarily screaming. I thought I would die. My husband took a picture of me hooked up to things, and I asked him why he did that. And he said, because I didn't know if I'd see you alive again. What did I learn, and how can that help you be that sort of leader? First of all, these horrors are, if we view them correctly, opportunities. This experience was to some extent a physical crisis, but it was more fundamentally a spiritual crisis. I wasn't connected. Even though I was on a journey that was founded on connection, I wasn't as deeply connected with who I and what I needed to be in this world as much as I was determined to have the financial success, the impact, all of these other things that come after the connection. My number was up, and the hospital and this sickness forced me to sit and think, if I am going to make it out of here, what am I going to stand for and what am I going to be? So number one, understand who you are, like you just said, and what you want to be. That's tip number one. Tip number two, while I was sick, there was times in which I was in so much pain that I could barely think. And I'll never forget, in the bed next to mine, there was a curtain dividing us. There was an elderly man, he was in his 80s, who was dying. And every day, men would come from his community and they'd surround his bed and they'd start to sing. And when those songs came out, somehow, I'd stop feeling the pain. I'd feel nothing but peace. I realized from that that sometimes the answers that we need to who and what we are aren't within, but the noises from outside, or the things that we think are noises, actually can provide us with the answers. Use the resources out there. Listen for the voices that you might not feel like you want to hear in the moment, but really are songs. And finally, never stop gratitude. As I was leaving, my husband had told me that when I got home, he would make me cheesecake. And while I was waiting for him to come home, I heard down the hall a woman screaming from the bottom of her guts. She screamed again and again, and all of the hospital staff on the floor dropped what they were doing and they ran to her. I sat there and waited, and when she finally came back, or when my nurse finally came back, I asked him what was happening. And he said, a woman lost someone that she really cared about. I couldn't help but think about the polarity of life, Sejal. My husband was going to make me cheesecake, but this woman could never make cheesecake. I was going to eat cheesecake, and whoever she was there for was never going to eat it. There was gratitude, even as I went through pain. Those are some tips that I have that suffering, trauma, dealing with things beyond what I ever expected have taught me, and I've brought them into my life as I step into who and what I'm meant to be even more deeply. And if you want to be resilient, my process or processes of any other competent transformational coach, the one that's right for you, will get you there. But please don't ever forget these things.
No, those are so important, Scott. And, I when I was kind of preparing for our conversation today, what was one tip that I can share, and your situation, usually when we go through tough times, right? When I think about my challenges that I've gone through, usually there's some early warning signs, right? That we could feel something's not right, whether it's a collaboration you're going to do with someone else, right? And you're like, something's just not resonating right. Recently we had to make a tough decision at the studio, a tough call with a potential Series A partner, right? And I remember having a conversation with our chief nobody about the situation, and he said, something is just not resonating right. We're not aligned on certain things, and I don't know if this is the right move for us as a studio. And he spoke with several members of our leadership team, some of our angel investors, and we had to really quickly reassess our strategy and pivot and look at other options. And it was really hard because he paid attention to those early warning signs instead of just overlooking them, which is what a lot of people do during tough times. With yours, though, there were no really warning signs. I mean, it was a physical, something that was happening with your body and you didn't even know about it. And then all of a sudden you were there and you had to deal with it. Right. And so what do you do in those situations where there are no red flags, where it just happens out of the blue? If you could talk a little bit on that issue.
You raise within that something important that anyone who is listening to or watching this down the road may ask themselves. What on earth was it that I had? The horror of it was that not only was it sudden, but that no one knows. They know that I caught a pathogen. It wasn't like some autoimmune thing, but no one has any idea what it was. And why I raise that is because that's exactly, from a metaphorical perspective, what you're talking about. A sudden disaster happens, whether it's a Series A situation that you just described or some other unexpected thing that requires an answer, but there is no answer. I could never and never will have an answer about what made me sick, and I'll never know how I got better or if I will be safe again. But I do know this, that answers define. Answers create boxes. Uncertainty, as painful as it can be, opens the door to creativity. And so when you're faced with this sort of situation, what I urge people to do, going back to your question, is to step into the uncertainty, see it for what it truly is, the chance for creativity. We too often, going back to the concept of toxic myths, view uncertainty as a doomsday or the end of the world or an entry into spiritual or business or other darkness. Really, it's a chance to build, to do something new. We just have to be able to go there. Does that answer your question, Sage?
Yeah, no, and I love that. And I would just add to that for people that are leaders or founders or anybody that's going through a tough time and you don't have those early morning signs. You know, Scott's given you some great practical tips. And I would just add one more. And again, just focusing on your situation too, and the situation I described at the studio, it became so important to have that supportive network, you know, of people that really truly have your back. I mean, people were coming together on LinkedIn for you, Scott. We were all sending each other messages. We were like, what can we do to help support him? And we did the same thing with the studio when we went through this situation, you know, that we kept the lines of communication with the stakeholders, the investors, the partners, and the core team. We stuck to the core values, right? We were transparent about what was going on. And we knew that there were going to be some people that weren't going to be happy with the news, and there were going to be some that were happy with this news. But whatever feedback we got and the insights we got really helped us navigate through that uncertainty. And at the end of the day, just like with you, right? You're sitting here, you're stronger than ever. You're more connected with your passion and what you want to do and the impact that you are making in the world. Same thing with the studio. The whole situation really highlighted for me and for all of us the team's willingness to adapt. And really, I feel like it made us stronger as a team.
Thank you. And I have to respond, going back to the top of the hour's discussion. What attracted me to the culture of Nobody Studios? I talked about what attracted me to it, but what did this experience prove to me about the culture of Nobody Studios? You know, Sajal, there are times, I'm sure you felt the same way, where we wonder whether those that we meet on our professional journeys really do care, or whether they just see us as sources of value to them. Nobody Studios, in particular the people in Webdelics, they were there. And it's hard to describe when you're in your deepest moment of despair. You don't know if you're going to make it home, or if you make it home, whether you'll be able to walk again, because that itself was at issue. You don't know whether people will turn away. But the people at Webdelics and Nobody Studios, they rallied. They didn't have to. They could have just waited for me to get better and then said, okay, you know, if I didn't get better, goodbye. But that wasn't the way it was. When you talk about the Nobody culture, when you talk about culture, that to me is what has defined it. And that's something that for as long as I live, I will never forget and make sure that other people know about too.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that, because I was going to ask you, because you've been with the studio now for quite some time, right?
Yes.
And I was going to ask you, how would you describe, you know, what's been your experience like? You know, I love hearing about that, right? Getting feedback from people about what is your experience like at the studio? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? You know, like every organization, it's not perfect. And we definitely have a lot of work to do, right? To get the studio to the type of culture that I know that Mark and I and the rest of the leadership team are striving to get to. But I love asking people, what has been your experience, you know, with the culture? And so you just sort of started going into that question before I even asked it. But is there anything else you want to add on that question?
As mentioned earlier, I worked in government for nearly 20 years. In a major city under administrations like the ones I worked for, Rudolph Giuliani's and Michael Bloomberg's, it may not shock you to find out that they attracted a lot of people who really, really were into power for its own sake and weren't necessarily concerned with your feelings or how anything impacted you. I had an agency head tell me in front of my staff and my colleagues that when I speak, I sound so stupid, I should just put a gun in my mouth and shoot it. That would never happen with Nobody Studios. Or if it did, I'm sure there would be someone in a leadership position would say to whoever said that, can we have a little conversation later? And that
please come to me.
And that sort of thing would not just fly. What I've found with Nobody Studios is as polar opposite as possible. Leadership and how culture manifests always exists on a spectrum. what I'm finding with Nobody Studios is the opposite end of the spectrum. And for someone like me who's creative, who's independent, and who thrives when supported, and I have to say, I'm finding is that's consistently across the board. How can we help you be your greatest self? What ideas do you have? You know what? That idea might not be right for us at this moment, but you've engaged with thinking. How can we welcome you? How can we bring fun and joy, not terror and oppression? These are big deals. As someone who experienced the opposite, part of why I am so committed to the culture that we've built is that I know what it's like on the other side, and I take it seriously. So in terms of how I'm experiencing it, hey, from my perspective, I've gone from the underworld to Mount Olympus. That's just keeping it real.
Oh my God, you just made my day. Thank you so much. And look, I know we're at time. I knew this was going to happen, of course, but I have one last question. You know, you're already doing a lot for Webdelics. You know, we've talked about other sort of projects that we want to involve you in, but you have a lot of superpowers, Scott Mason. You've got a lot of them. So how would you like to take your superpowers and help us take the studio to the next level? What are some of the things that you would like to get involved in and do for the studio to help us build those 100 companies, Scott? We got to start. Let's go.
Look, one thing I'll never forget when I first met Mark, one of our first two conversations that we had is, you know, there are a zillion different creative ideas that I have, and no one has ever accused me of lacking imagination or particularly any sort of visual or presentational aesthetic. But one of the things that I believe is a superpower, and hey, y'all challenge me if I'm wrong, is the ability to use my voice, my presence, to be able to be the herald of what we're doing. Why do I suspect that I was asked to be the host of the Webdelics podcast? To some extent, it's because I have the ability to make that emotional connection with people when they're talking about things that are vulnerable to them. That's part of the overall skill set. And some of it is because I have had the podcasting background to be able to competently host, as well as demonstrated the ability to build an audience. But really, what I would say, and I've heard over and over, is my superpower is the ability to be that trumpet who can stand on the rooftop and play and make sure that people hear. And part of why I consider it so important to be on shows like this that the studios put together is so that I can use that superpower on this platform to make sure that whatever way, for those who are willing and able to hear and who like what they hear from me, to be able to take the message in and share it. What Nobody Studios is doing matters. It's important. It deserves the full force behind what every one of our talents are. And that voice, I've been told, is mine.
Definitely. If you haven't listened to the Webdelics podcast, people, get on it right away. It is phenomenal when you hear people's stories. There was one episode, I forget the name of the guest. I should have written it down, but I was literally in tears. And it was just, it started off as tears of like pain for this person, you know, this woman that was on the show, but it ended up being tears of joy just to hear how she's come out of the situation she was dealing with the help of plant medicine, and now is living a life and again, empowering other people to live that life as well. Right. Yeah. So thank you so much, Scott, for taking time. I know you're super busy to have this conversation, and for everything that you're doing for Webdelics. Again, we've got the website on the screen here, webdelics.com. Check it out. If anything that we talked about today, either at Webdelics or at Nobody Studios resonates with you, take a look at our Nobody Studios website. We're going to need a lot of talent, a lot of influence, and a lot of capital to reach our goal of building 100 companies. So take a look at our website and reach out to any one of us if you have more questions. Thank you again, Scott. So great to see you. Have a great week, everyone. Bye.